Welcome to Ohio Roots, the official podcast of the Ohio Genealogical Society. Join us as we embark on a captivating journey through Ohio's rich genealogy, history, and abundant resources. Hosted by me, OGS Executive Director Noel Poirier, this podcast brings you insightful conversations with a diverse array of guests, from OGS members, chapter leaders, and staff to renowned genealogists, historians, and influential figures within the genealogical community. Each episode delves into fascinating topics and captivating stories. So grab your headphones, hit that play button, and join us on this enthralling journey of Ohio's roots. Today's guest is Katharine O'Connell, a nationally recognized forensic genealogist and owner of North Coast Genealogy. Katharine has worked on more than 250 probate and title cases, helping attorneys, banks, and families locate missing heirs and unravel complex family histories. She's an author, mentor, and sought-after speaker who is trained in advanced DNA techniques and presented across the country. Whether she's tracing family trees through dusty archives or tangling modern legal disputes, Katharine brings a detective's persistence and a genealogist's passion to every case, and I'm thrilled to welcome her to the OGS Ohio Roots podcast. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Katharine O'Connell. Well, Katharine O'Connell, thank you so much for joining me today on the OGS Ohio Roots podcast. I appreciate you taking some time out of your day for me.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm looking forward to a good conversation about genealogy.
Well, let's start. I asked all of my guests the question of what was it? What was it? A person? Was it a family member, a hook that got you interested in genealogy in the first place?
Well, I feel kind of like an outlier because I was always interested in history. I always enjoyed, family stories and stuff like that. But I actually kind of stumbled into this by accident. I was looking for a job, and a friend of mine was married to a private investigator who looked for missing people and things like that for attorneys, and just needed someone to help order records. And I thought, well, I can do that. So I started out with that, and then he started having me research cases, and I just totally fell in love with it. I just loved it, but I had no really idea what even the field was called. He was into he was like, I'm a private investigator who does this work. So I never heard the word genealogy. Right. And then I wanted some more education. So I went online and found Katharine Desmarais, who's a great forensic genealogist, and took her class at GRIP with Michael Ramage, and discovered there was this whole huge field of study out there that I didn't even know about. And so I was hooked, and I really enjoyed it since.
Because you dropped the word, could you, for folks who aren't familiar with what we talk about when we talk about forensic genealogy, can you explain that process for folks, what it's for?
Yeah, I think it's really kind of any field of genealogy where you're doing it for a legal purpose. Mm-hmm. So in my branch, I'm looking for people for estates, like if somebody dies and nobody knows who their next of kin is, who would inherit. That's one branch. There's a branch of looking for uniting remains of military personnel with their families after they've been, so that's work for the government. Sure. There can be criminal DNA work for cold cases and things like that. But it's anything that sort of has an interaction with the law. And there's a certain level of proof you have to find in order to meet legal standards. And I think that's pretty much the difference between that and just general genealogy.
Now, you've worked on over 250 probate cases, correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Can you walk us through kind of what a typical case is like for you?
Yeah. So the attorney will usually contact me and say, there's a missing person here and I can't find him, and nobody's heard from him since 2007. This was last week, and, we don't know anything about the family. We have no idea what's going on, but here's his date of birth. And could you please find him, or if he's dead, all his next of kin? So, I start working and kind of looking back and building a kind of a family structure, especially of the particular individual. And then sometimes it's somebody that they know is deceased. Most of my cases where they know the person's deceased, but they had no brothers and sisters, they had no kids. And so we're looking for the next of kin on both the maternal and paternal side. And so we really need to find all the living members of the father's family and the mother's family who would be due to inherit. So I do the intake for them. I sign the contract, and then we start looking.
Now, when you're doing that, I assume you're using the same tools any other genealogist is going to use, correct?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, for sure.
There aren't any specialized tools that you rely on that somebody else might not use?
I don't think so. But one thing I think we always are sure to do is, because this is like for a legal case, we want to find legal documents. Sure. So a lot of vital records aren't available to people, in a lot of states. But if we can find a will, if we can find a divorce record, a marriage record, those things, we're trying to order things from the court because a court has already signed off on those. And so they have a certain level of weight with the court when we're trying to prove a case.
How do you kind of balance the genealogy aspect of it, just wanting to do the genealogy aspect of it, with kind of the standards that are required for specific legal cases? Because as you mentioned, there are genealogical records that may not qualify as a legal document, correct?
Yeah, I think one thing I try to do is we try to have we kind of triangulate, and we try to have a couple of sources for everything. So if we don't have a legal document, say, of a divorce, but we have both parents' obituaries, then you have two people, stating who their children are. And then you might have a third document that shows a marriage record or something that lists the parents as well. So when we can't get a legal document, we try to have multiple sources. And I think that really, that goes a long way with the court too. And we have to cite single thing that we do. So a report has a lot of, a lot of footnotes, and then we oftentimes do a document exhibit file showing the work that we've done.
Right. It just sounds like the proof of evidence, the burden of evidence is pretty strong when you're doing forensic genealogy versus, say, me just doing genealogy on an ancestor.
Yeah, I think so. But I think it's not anymore like, I think that anybody doing research on an ancestor, you also would want multiple sources to just make sure that you have the right person. So I don't think it's a whole lot different. Okay. But I guess just the risk is different, because if you miss somebody, if you skip a child, they can sue the attorney and us. And so like that, I think that kind of tightrope.
Yeah, I'm not in any danger of that.
Exactly. You're not. And so, but that can sort of intimidate people, I think, a little bit. And I think, that's why we carry insurance. And, that's the first thing I tell anybody is, if you're going to do this work, make sure that you have, like a errors and omissions liability insurance, because this stuff is, it's serious if you make a mistake. We haven't done that. I've never done that yet, but, you've got to be very, very careful.
Now, you've also trained pretty extensively in DNA analysis. How important has that become to forensic genealogy?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I think certain branches of forensic genealogy, like military repatriation and, and criminal, I think that's sort of central to it. The thing I found is I'm very interested in DNA. I've done a couple of cases where it's been background research for a case, but the law actually has not recognized DNA. Okay. And so as far as probate, so I think lawyers tell me, well, we don't want people coming out of the woodwork saying we've got this DNA test that would override a will. Okay. And so they really rely on paper documents. Now that may change, but right now we don't, the cases I work on, they don't accept DNA as any source of proof. You have to find an additional source of proof. So that's kind of interesting, I think. That
is. It's almost the reverse of the criminal side of use of DNA, isn't it?
Yeah, it kind of is. But one thing I think that's coming up, and this is a really small niche thing, is, now that embryos are being recognized as people, finding, you might need to use DNA and figuring out if that actually exists. Sometimes people have in their will that they recognize these as their children. And so I think that's going to be the next really big, tough area of research, is like we might have to find people's embryos because they're in some states, they're recognized as their children.
I could imagine that could be a considerable challenge.
Yes, especially if there's nothing written about it,
Yeah.
like people would need to have some kind of legal documents, but that seems to be, an area of law that's really developing that I find is just fascinating.
Hi, everyone. Noel Poirier here, Executive Director of the Ohio Genealogical Society and your host for the Ohio Roots podcast. Did you know you can help preserve the past and empower the future? Your donation to the Ohio Genealogical Society helps protect vital family history records and supports research for generations to come. Visit www.ogs.org/donate and give today. Thank you so much for your support. If you enjoy listening to the Ohio Roots podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could go to whatever platform it is that you listen and give us a good review. Reviews help us get more listeners and reach more people with Ohio Roots and what we're trying to do with the Ohio Genealogical Society. So please leave us a nice review, and thanks for listening. You mentioned the fact that that DNA in probate at least isn't something that's acknowledged as evidence per se, but are there other kind of ethical dilemmas that deal with using DNA and doing forensic genealogy, things like privacy and unexpected parentage and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I think about a lot, but I haven't seen it in a legal case before. But I did have a case where I had to do background for, the attorney said, I've got this guy who says he's the son of a famous person. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if his claim is correct, but, he wants a share of the estate. And we don't know if he's just making stuff up or if it's real. Right. So I did some background on that. And it turns out, yeah, he was actually, genetically related to this person. But, that person had not taken a DNA test and was deceased, and nobody in the family had. And I was just very kind of concerned about he owned the test and he could have gone to the press with some of my research. And so I was concerned about that because it was there was the privacy of the family kind of at stake, and yet this man's claim as well. And it turned out there was no legal way for him to inherit, but there was nothing stopping him from using my work to maybe do a news story or something like that. Right. So I felt very conflicted about that because, I thought the attorney would own my report, but it turns out he gave the report to the client. Now, it ended up being okay, but it was something that really made me, lose some sleep wondering about the ethics and the privacy of that.
Right, and I think that I've spoken to a number of folks who do DNA genealogy, and I know we discuss oftentimes the ethics of that and the respect of other people's privacy from DNA. Just because you're related doesn't mean you have a right to tell them that that's there.
I know. Yeah.
So it sounds really like that would be a challenge. From what I read, from the material I read on you, you've worked with attorneys, you've worked with banks, you've worked with private investigators, you've worked with journalists even. What makes collaborating with these folks doing forensic genealogy successful for you?
Well, I just really like working with people, and I just love people in general, and I love, all these different stories and things like that. So I think in general, when I'm working on an international case, when I'm doing something, where I have to work with another genealogist to get a specific record, say in another country or something like that, we just need a really clear objective. Mm-hmm. So that, they stay within what they're supposed to do and I'm staying in with what I'm supposed to do. Because one of the things we always have to be cognizant of is we're spending, the state's money. And so, the lawyer has a certain number of hours we're allowed to do. And so we really have to fit in that little number of hours that we have. Right. And so that's sort of my primary objective is we want to get as much as we can, but we can't take any extra time to do it. And that is a constant, that's, I think, one of the toughest parts of the job is limiting the hours and limiting the objective.
Yeah, I can imagine. I'm just from doing genealogy that I do, I can go down a rabbit hole and spend hours. So I could see how when you're actually on a clock, and a very firm clock, it can be a challenge to get where you want to go.
Yeah.
In all the cases you've done, and you've done missing heir cases and those types of things, can you walk us through one of the most challenging cases that you've worked on?
Oh my gosh, we've had a bunch of really tough ones lately, but we had an interesting one last year where it was actually a couple years ago, where there didn't seem to be any surviving children on either side of the descendant's family. And then it seemed like he had no surviving aunts or uncles on the maternal or the paternal side. So there was like no family that had survived. But this heir research firm, they sign up family members for a percentage of their inheritance.
Okay.
And they don't need to do that because, we find them and contact them as part of the estate. But this opposing lawyer had signed up like 30 people on this case and said, we think that you're going to be next of kin because there's no aunts and uncles or anybody that we can find. So we're going up one level to great grandparents, and you're going to inherit this $1 million estate. So there were 30 people represented by a couple of different lawyers who had filed suit trying to get this estate. And the lawyer's like, we don't know if they are the relatives, and we don't know who really should get it. So we were starting to evaluate like whether these people were related, whether they were, and we found more people that had not signed up. And as we were going through it, we saw this census record for this person who was listed as an adopted son, but of this daughter. So this would be like the 31st heir.
Oh, geez.
But then we ordered the daughter's divorce record, and she had divorced with no children, and she died in a mental hospital. So that was like some drama that you're just reading about in records, which was, interesting and kind of sad. We had to find those records to make sure it didn't mention children. But this guy was not her child. So then whose was he? And so we tried to order his birth certificate because we started to think he might be the closest person. If he was the adopted son of the great-grandfather, he would have gotten all of it. And he was deceased, but he had no birth certificate, and his death certificate to the wife didn't know who his parents were. So there's nothing on there. And we were against these other lawyers, and we were really worried that like, if we didn't have good enough proof, they were going to, sue about this. So we found his records just little by little and discovered that he was actually this adopted son. And he was 20 years younger than his other brothers and sisters because they were all the biological ones of a previous marriage.
Okay.
So his mother had this previous marriage. He was born, and the dad deserted. And so she gave up that baby for adoption. And he went to a whole separate family. So that's why he had no birth certificate, because it was under a different name. Then she remarried to this older guy, and they adopted her child back.
Okay.
And I'd never seen anything like it. So he had died young, but he inherited $1 million, and he had one daughter, and she had no idea who any of these people were, but she got the whole estate. And these 30 people who had claimed, they just vanished. Like when we found that adoption record, they just went away.
That's wild.
She had never heard a word about these people because it was so distant in the relationship. Yeah, it was really crazy.
I'm keeping my fingers crossed that I've got an ancestor
I keep thinking someday, can I get a call about that? Yeah. Can I, am I related to this family? So that was wild.
So in doing forensic genealogy, do you feel like, I sense, at least in my, anecdotally, I'm hearing a lot more about forensic genealogy in the news when it relates to both criminal and civil cases. How is forensic genealogy kind of shaping the future of law and family history?
I don't know, because, that's not really my area. Like I'm totally fascinated with it. And I think that we are seeing a lot of, I think we're able to solve more cold cases and things like that. Like, I think that's a big thing. And I think it's also showing some abuses that I think have happened. Like when, there's fertility doctors who use their own sperm and substituted that. And so now, and people are only finding out these kind of abuses when DNA has come around. So I think it's really shedding light on places where there hasn't been, a lot of oversight and making kind of people, sometimes I think it's holding people accountable or helping solve things. So I think that's a huge thing. I think it's a really difficult area for genealogists themselves, because I think a lot of law enforcement are now training their own people in how to analyze this, so that people who start out as genealogists are not part of law enforcement. They're having a little bit more trouble finding the jobs because, and I think part of the reason for that is that genealogists aren't trained in evidence collection and
Sure.
chain of custody and all the legal things that go on with it. And so I think there's been sometimes some kind of public mistakes or things like that that have
Right.
happened maybe as a result of not being trained in this. And so I think law enforcement's just doing it themselves. So I think we're seeing a really big shift in the DNA field.
Okay.
And there's lack of funding, I think, is also a part of it in the police departments for this. So there's just a lot of turmoil, and I think the dust hasn't settled in that area.
Okay. Yeah, it just seems like I mentioned anecdotally, it just seems like you'll hear every couple months about a case that has been broken because of a genealogist or someone doing genealogical research has stepped in and found somebody. And it just sounds like it's going to be an ongoing thing. But it also sounds from what you're saying like there are a lot of challenges to that actually working.
Yeah, but I think it's also really exciting how many things are how many records are digitized.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's just a lot of records that genealogists can find now that even like a couple years ago, more newspapers, more sources, and that has been really, really helpful, especially for like marginalized groups that don't have as many records out there.
Mm-hmm.
Just having just more data sets out there, I think has been extremely helpful. Locating people.
And I know reading your information that you've done research on African American and Native American ancestry and on some international cases. Do these cases doing forensic genealogy offer kind of unique challenges?
Yeah, they definitely do, because I think oftentimes you have internationally, it's just kind of interesting because you'll hit a certain point where there may be record loss in that country. So there's when you're doing immigrant cases, even over the last century, when World War II came, there was bombing, there was courthouse loss and things like that. Sometimes people coming to the U.S. from the Soviet Union and where records were, maybe not accessible anymore, were destroyed. And so you hit that there. And then here, oftentimes African Americans their records weren't preserved, or they didn't have access to leave a will or court records because for a long time, depending on where they lived, they may have been not have had they weren't allowed to legally leave those documents. And so there may not have been a family tradition of doing that. And so a lot of times those are missing, or they didn't publish obituaries because they didn't have access to the local newspapers. Mm-hmm. And so finding those families is much, much more difficult, I would say. But it's something I'm really committed to because I feel like, hey, everybody deserves their inheritance, right. And they deserve a fair shake at this. But it does take a lot more hours and you have to go to a lot more different sources to make sure that you've got everybody.
I know you've done some mentoring in the past, and so my final question to you is what advice would you give to someone who is just getting started in genealogy in general, but maybe just getting started in forensic genealogy? What's the best bit of advice you could give them?
Well, I think if you're just getting started in forensic, I would say be very patient with yourself, because I've had a lot of, I've got a team of 11 people right now who work with me, and I love working collaboratively with them. And I think all of them are just extremely well trained. But one thing, it's such a different field that I compare it to, like, if you were a football player and you decided that you were going to become a professional softball player or baseball player, you're in shape, you know the basic rules, but then once you start playing, you're like, this is a different game, And so I feel like that's, it's really different. You're not going in as much depth. It's very fast. You have a lot of, legal considerations. It's just a very different animal. So be patient with yourself. And I would say, work with somebody, like work for somebody first, so that you get the lay of the land, so that you don't have to try to do all this legal proof without experience. And somebody who's just a genealogist, I would say, we cite our sources and we write reports. And I think for anybody writing the stuff down and footnoting it, I know it sounds onerous, but then where your source was. And, even if it's just a URL and you've got an image somewhere, you're really keeping track of what you have and what you don't have. And I think that then you're not chasing after that census record that you saw 3 years ago and you can't remember where it was. It's like, oh, there it is. So I think, keeping track of your sources and really almost treating it like as if it was a legal case or something you had to prove to someone else, I think can really up your game for the level of research that you're doing.
Well, Katharine O'Connell, thank you so much for joining me today on the OGS Ohio Roots podcast. I appreciated you taking the time, and I enjoyed our discussion. Well, I really enjoyed that conversation with Katharine O'Connell today. She's fascinating, and the whole field of forensic genealogy is fascinating, and I really appreciated her insights into the field and into what it takes to really do it correctly and successfully. So again, I want to thank Katharine O'Connell for joining me today on the OGS Ohio Roots podcast. I want to thank you for listening. Have a great day. Curious about your family's Ohio past? The Ohio Genealogical Society is your gateway to uncovering generations of family history. Whether you're a seasoned researcher or just starting your journey, the OGS offers expert resources, local chapters, exclusive online records, online and in-person programs, and a passionate community ready to help you. Join today and bring your family story to life, because your family's history matters. Visit ogs.org to start your discoveries.
The Ohio Roots podcast is brought to you by the Ohio Genealogical Society, the premier gateway for discovering your Ohio family history. Hosted by OGS Executive Director Noel Poyer and edited by Luke Poyer. Theme song is Beautiful Ohio, recorded by Bob Stanley and his orchestra in 1944. To learn more about joining the Ohio Genealogical Society, visit www.ogs.org.